So we'll just start. Okay, so today, thank you for joining us. Amy Wax is with us. For those of our audience who haven't seen some of your work or read some of your writing, you were trained as a neurologist. You studied neurology, and you're currently the Robert Moynihan Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. You write about social welfare, law and policy, the family and the labour markets. And we've been here in Poland for a couple of days talking about various things, about virtues, about the academy and some of the problems with the academy. And so I wanted to ask your expert opinion on those topics for our Restoration podcast. So thanks for joining us. Firstly, for those who, like I said, don't already know, I wonder if you could explain a bit about your academic profession.
Well, I'm a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I started my legal career as a litigator at the Justice Department under President Reagan and Bush, and was in an office called the Office of Solicitor General, which handles the United States matters before the Supreme Court. Was there for 7+ years, and that was really challenging and exciting. Got to argue before the Supreme Court, so I enjoyed that. And then I decided to become a law professor. I started at the University of Virginia in 1994, and then I moved to University of Pennsylvania in 2001, and I've been teaching there ever since. But during that time, I haven't changed much, but the academy has changed drastically. I guess just to sum it up, it's gone totally woke. It's one of the institutions in American society that's really been captured by that ideology virtually completely. And there's very little room for people who run the gamut from classical liberalism to conservatism to what the powers that be like to term far right, which they use as a term of disapprobation, but of course it need not be, since it has some legitimate positions. So that makes me very unpopular.
Right. And someone asked yesterday, I think they asked you, since you were appointed in 2001, how many fellow conservatives have been brought onto your faculty? And I think the answer was very few.
Well, real conservatives hired since 2001, I would say the answer is zero.
Right. Okay.
They do occasionally permit some libertarians that, are sufficiently domesticated and have opinions mainly on economic issues that they tolerate. On social issues, on the hot button issues of gender and race and immigration and topics like that, that the wokeistas have very strong opinions about, highly moralized opinions. They tolerate little or no dissent, frankly.
Right. And what does that look like? Their lack of toleration of any dissent?
Well, the way it's looked for me is that in the wake of some of my remarks, public remarks, which are supposed to be protected by longstanding principles of academic free expression, in the wake of those, my dean, now former dean, a man named Ted Ruger, brought me up on formal charges at my university, disciplinary charges for quote unquote misconduct. Now, of course, my conduct consisted entirely of speech. Speech is conduct, so we have a little bit of sophistry there, to say the least. But I've basically been indicted for having the wrong opinions and expressing them openly. They've tacked on some allegations of student mistreatment, but those are bogus. They're spurious, and they're just pretextual, and frankly, they're ridiculous. I could go into some details.
So do you think that your situation would be different if you had more support in your faculty and in the academy in the form of other people who are potentially conservative, have conservative sympathies?
It's hard to say because the people in control and the people in the majority, by far, are not conservative.
Right.
So it's very difficult for me hypothetically to speculate as to whether a significant minority would have any influence or any leverage.
Yeah.
It might help because, of course, conservatives in objecting to my treatment, or anyone objecting to my treatment, has right on their side. I mean, long-standing traditions of academic free expression, embodied in a number of informal and more formal statements of policy and position that law schools purportedly adhere to. And here things get a little complicated because none of this is really written into law, especially for a private institution, which is ostensibly what my institution is, University of Pennsylvania. So we're not governed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. We're only governed by the terms of my contract, the terms of my tenure, and these understandings of what my protections are that have not all that often been tested, certainly to the extent that they are being tested in my case.
Because previously you think they've been bounded by norms in academia which have protected that kind of
Yes, I think that
speech.
there's been more respect for the norms, and fewer occasions to test the norms. I mean, frankly, because number one, there was greater tolerance for a broader spectrum of opinion, even if grudging, and the level of intolerance that the woke regime has brought with it is something relatively new. So that's what's new. And secondly, the academy has been left-leaning for a very long time. I mean, there have been fewer and fewer true conservatives in the academy as time has gone on, and this has been a decades-long development. And also, I mean, the third factor is that academics are a very cowardly bunch, and they are reluctant to express opinions that they know will displease the powers that be, to be outspoken in that way, because frankly, they have a very cushy life and enjoy a very privileged position in society, and I recognize that. And I don't think they want to really push the envelope. And also, collegiality is very important to what they do, getting along with their colleagues, fellow professors, and the like.
So it seems to me that aside from sort of the persecution of serious academics in the academy, a great shame is for students who actually want to attend the best universities in the world, students of the Ivy Leagues who want to be exposed to a variety of different ideas with people from different backgrounds, I suppose, but really with different sort of academic backgrounds and different sort of academic philosophies. So how do those students go about finding an environment where they can be exposed to conservative thought? Do you create little enclaves? I think you mentioned that you have a class for conservative thought.
Yes, I think it's very difficult. A trend that I have observed is that education has become more and more one-sided. There's a lack of balance in the points of view presented. Just in all sorts of ways it manifests itself. Certain ideas just never get expressed, never get explained. Certain events the students are completely oblivious to. And this really precedes law school. I mean, it occurs from kindergarten on. One of the things I'll be talking about tomorrow is the corruption of so-called K through 12 education, that is kindergarten through high school in the United States, which has been completely taken over by leftist thinking, leftist ideology. So less and less are students exposed to these ideas. the example I like to give is students, the curriculum is obsessed with the hot topics of race and gender, multiculturalism, that sort of thing. So a lot of the students have taken courses in these topics, but they are courses that are highly selective in what they cover. So if you learn about the history of race in America, you really should learn about something called the Moynihan Report, which was a mid-1960s report that was written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was an advisor to President Nixon, and warned about the ill effects of the breakdown of the Black family and predicted dire consequences, much of which has come to be. And my students have never heard of the Moynihan Report.
And how do they respond when you put it in front of them or ask them to
They're
look at it and read it?
interested, they're curious. Certainly the ones who come to my classes,
Right, because they've already
who are
selected to
seeking
come
me
and,
out, they've already decided that something is wrong with education that they're getting, or they're dissatisfied with it. For every one of them, there's dozens. It's hard for me to know how many who are perfectly satisfied with the version of reality that they've been exposed to. But I tend to get the skeptics, and they are very interested and fascinated by what they don't know. So that's just one example among many. I teach a course in conservative political and legal thought.
Right.
It's a year-long course, and it's one of the very few that covers the materials that we actually cover. Now, there are courses occasionally, and I consider them very superficial, about the recent history of American politics. Start with Ronald Reagan, talk a little bit about Reaganism, come up through the Republican administrations. I mean, they think that studying the American Republican Party is equivalent to studying conservatism.
Right, I see. So how far back?
So that's like the first delusion.
Right, that's a classic.
Yeah, and of course it isn't.
Yeah,
Not even close.
I'm curious, then how far back do you go in the history of conservative legal
Well,
thought?
I go all the way back to Edmund Burke.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
I focus
Fortescue?
on Anglo-American
Right, okay.
thought.
Yep.
There's obviously a whole, there's the topic of continental thought and thinkers that I could go into. But when you teach a course in conservatism, you immediately realize what a vast topic it is. How much material there is. There's no one school of conservatism. There are conservatisms, and conservative thought is not an ideology in the same sense that leftist thought is. It's this kind of cluster of different ideas and propensities and inclinations, as Michael Oakeshott so puts it so well, dispositions, and teaching that is a challenge.
I suppose a great starting point with conservative thoughts, particularly in the Anglo world, is a robust appreciation of the common law and the history of the common law as,
Right. So, I mean, a
really good
lot of
position.
the course is about law, what it means to be a conservative and in the legal realm. So we read James Fitzjames Stephen, who's a much overlooked figure, and was a conservative jurist and lawyer in the late 19th century, and was a critic of John Stuart Mill. So that's an important part of our syllabus. We look at various schools of thought about legal interpretation, originalism, of course, but common law constitutionalism as well, which is an inherently conservative approach to law. And those traditions, we look at the criminal law and justifications for the various schools of thought in criminal law, retribution, which is now considered a sort of conservative way of thinking about enforcement of criminal criminal statutes and punishment and the like. So, there's a lot to cover here.
Yeah.
And the first semester is devoted to the basic ideas and the theory and the interpretation of and legal topics. The second semester, we look at, the various hot topics and current controversies.
Right, I see.
Like
Once they've got the foundation.
gender, race, race realism, just ranging freely over immigration, foreign. We added this year a session on conservative approaches to American foreign relations, which was suggested by one of my students and turned out to be a real omission in the class.
Really, yeah.
Which is very, very...
Because you realize that because when the topic comes up, everyone has something to say. It's sort of...
Well, I think it's very timely.
Right, yeah.
Right now we have a lot of controversy surrounding how much involvement the United States should have in areas like the Middle East and the Ukrainian conflict, and even within the conservative camp, there's really a fair variety of opinion. I think the student, it was in some ways very challenging. The student says, well, what is the conservative approach to these controversies? I said, there is no one approach, right?
Yeah.
There are approaches. It's the gamut from, neoconservatism, which is nation building and democracy peddling, to neo-isolationism, to just flat out isolationism. And those schools have always been there.
And they're sort of vying for control in conservative thought, basically.
They're vying for dominance.
So then I'm curious, those students who come and seek out your class to sort of study under you, do they tend to be conservatives? Or are they just extremely curious people? Or is there a range?
Well, there's various categories. Yeah. There's conservatives, students who I think have conservative instincts, are interested in particular conservative issues, like there are pro-lifers. Some of them tend to be religious and come from more conservative parts of the country, like the South, or they're evangelicals. So there's that category. And then I have what I call the seekers, or, the cynics, the disgruntled types who wonder about the ideologies and the dogmas that they've been peddled and taught, and think that there must be a different point of view, want to hear about it. And those people are not necessarily conservative, although I like to think that when they're done with the course, some of them have become conservatives. Right. But, I will have students come in who say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, but I'm just curious. They're curious. And I think that is unusual. Yeah. Just to dare to be curious about a different point of view is considered a bold and daring thing.
And for those who don't end up being sort of converts to conservatism or a more conservative way of looking at life, do you think they sort of soften towards maybe their conservative peers or their conservative colleagues?
I think they have a better and more intellectually empathic viewpoint about how there could be good faith opposition to the dominant ideology. Yeah. I have one student in particular. I'm thinking about a woman that I was in my class last year, who I recently had coffee with, who told me outright that she, for the first time, began to see what she called the logic of conservative viewpoints, where it's coming from. It's not just coming from this nasty racism and sexism and all of these evil impulses, but has a broader and more respectable rationale, or more understandable rationale.
Right. So sort of in a more sort of with a broader picture to the academy in general, if you do have a series of Ivy League colleges or universities across the West, not just in America, I mean in Britain as well, there are similar problems. How do you solve for the problem of Amy Wax being the only conservative on the faculty? Do you create parallel institutions? Do those universities soften towards conservatives in some way through pressure from the state or local government or whoever funds them? What does the future of conservatism in the academy look like? Or what would you like it to look like?
Well, I wish I had a magical, solution to the problem. I think it's a very hard problem to solve because these institutions are very powerful, very influential, and they're kind of closed loops in a way. I mean, certainly the private institutions, which are the most high profile and powerful institutions, schools like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they are private ostensibly. I mean, they actually receive tons of government money, but that doesn't make you an arm of the public or of the government in the United States. It does give the government some leverage, and I can talk about that in a minute. And they are self-perpetuating and self-governing. So they decide, who gets hired, who gets admitted, who gets promoted, what sorts of projects and viewpoints get prestige and are considered, sound and valid, as opposed to shoddy and unconvincing. I mean, by making judgments which academic institutions have to make and cannot avoid making about better or worse ideas, that gives them a platform for, excluding or downgrading ideas they don't like, and there aren't really great checks on that.
Right.
Now, there is the camp and the school that says we need to create parallel institutions, and I think that's one strategy. The problem with that strategy is it doesn't really work to erode the power and the prestige of these long-standing universities that still have a lot of support, even among people who don't necessarily agree with what's being peddled.
Really? The sort of the donors who have fond
The
memories
donors,
of
yes, they're very loyal. And they also, it's just not just loyalty, I call it the little Caitlin problem. Their daughter and their granddaughter, little Caitlin, they want her to get into Princeton, they want her to get out of Princeton, and they don't really care that much about what she's being taught at Princeton, and don't really go into it because most of these people are not terribly intellectual, and they just see these institutions as the gateway to secure upper middle class life and jobs and prestige and status, and they're right. I mean, they are. So I can't really fault them for that. But I don't think we can look to the donors with just a very few exceptions, and maybe we're seeing a little more action on that front in the wake of the October 7th events, that donors are starting to get a little dissatisfied.
So they've become uncomfortable with some of the things that they've seen on campus.
Correct.
I suppose they must also become slightly uncomfortable once Caitlin has left university and she's gone a bit crazy, maybe. But I suppose it's too late then.
Right. I mean, Caitlin has gone far left, overboard, and, is now like a total wokeista, maybe.
But maybe she works at Google or a good law firm and she has a great job, and that's what parents want for their kids, really.
Right. I mean, I think they find, some of their attitudes annoying, but frankly, some of the parents share those points of view. Those are the fashionable points of view. And as Rob Henderson says, they're luxury beliefs. I mean, these people are living your standard upper middle class life.
Yeah.
I mean, a few of these young ladies mostly, although both sexes are involved, will get their nose pierced and, go off and join Antifa, and that's not the desired outcome. But those people are in the minority, truly.
Yeah.
So the donors, have no real reason to be disgruntled. I mean, we do have some of the wealthy Jewish donors rebelling
Right.
against what they perceive to be anti-Semitism on campus. That is a whole other topic, of course, but it remains to be seen how far that's going to be taken.
Yeah.
So how do you break into it? I mean, how do you start to reform these institutions? Well, you know, Eric Kaufman, who is a sociologist in Britain who I greatly respect, he believes firmly that the law can be used to sort of break up the mafia, the woke mafia of the universities. In the United States, there are some things
So
that...
through the law, through the like implementation of free speech.
Well, yes. So how would the
legislation.
law do that? I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of controls does the law have over big, wealthy private universities in the United States? I think things are a little bit different in Britain, where most of these, I don't know the status of the British universities, but a lot of public universities, and I think the law has a lot more control over them. In the United States, the main tool for controlling private universities, I mean, we can leave aside public universities for a moment because they're important too. But private universities is something called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act essentially says that any institution receiving public funds, as all of these universities do, to the tune of, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars through their scientific establishment, fellowship programs, this and that, they have to comply with certain requirements, and those requirements are focused on non-discrimination against protected categories of people, race, sex, etc. Well, those conditions for receipt of public funds could be expanded greatly, I think. One obvious expansion would be...
Now, this is for receipt of public funds. So this is the leverage you were talking about earlier, potentially.
Receipt of government, mostly federal funds, but, you know, the state could also get into the act because these schools get state funds too. One really important measure, I think, would be to demand that they comply with the First Amendment.
Right, okay.
Which many of them voluntarily say they do, even though in practice, like, they totally don't. I mean, in my case, they've violated the First Amendment in the way they've treated me, but there's no ready enforcement mechanism if the government won't act. So what they should attach to that condition is the right to sue in court.
So create an actual action.
A cause of action,
right, okay,
yes.
fine.
So they absolutely need to create a cause of action. Right. And if I had a federal cause of action for violation of the First Amendment against my university, that would be very helpful.
Right.
You know, I mean, it would be nice to have that. I mean, they've voluntarily adopted the First Amendment. I can try and leverage that, but, you know, there's no real precedent for how that would pan out and whether a court would take that seriously. I mean, I hope they would, but so the second thing they could do is set out conditions for whether you could have diversity, inclusion, and equity programs, administrators, bureaucracies. I mean, essentially tell the universities you have to get rid of your DIE departments,
Right, I see.
which are these massive, you know, infrastructures, often involving hundreds of people.
I mean, the administrative staff to teaching staff ratio at some of these universities is huge. It's hugely in favor of the
there are
admin
more
staff and HR
administrators.
departments.
Correct. In some of these places, there are more administrators than there are teachers.
Right,
So they could set ratio requirements. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the burgeoning of administrative staff is not just the result of these diversity initiatives, which are, you know, race conscious and illegal for that reason, but the result of all of these federal reporting requirements and accreditation requirements and all of these, you know, all of these sort of administrative requirements that the government has already imposed. So a lot of those could be dialed back. I think the Department of Education is a menace to society and needs, I mean, ideally, Department of Education would be abolished.
Right.
That's
Afuera.
not that easy because it administers all these programs of federal loans and funding and special funding for disadvantaged groups. And I mean, there's a whole program for universities that admit a certain percentage of Hispanic students. I mean, that's a race-conscious program, which technically should be illegal, especially after the Harvard affirmative action case, which essentially says, Title VI, the statute we're interpreting, does not allow any race-conscious programming or action on the part of the universities.
But
should be taken seriously.
Should be taken seriously, but you don't think it is being taken seriously?
No.
Or you don't think that case has had much of an impact?
No. I mean, it remains to be seen because it's a new case.
Yes. Okay.
And I mean, these cases, these decisions are only as good as their implementation. I mean, somebody has to identify a violation, get standing to sue, actually sue, stick their neck out, be identified as someone who's challenging the way the universities run things. There are a lot of steps to enforcement.
I suppose it's been slightly embarrassing for the institution maybe, and also has brought this conversation into the public discourse in a more sort of official kind of way, which could be useful down the line.
Well, it has done that, but frankly, these institutions are unembarrassable.
Right.
I mean, they are absolutely convinced that the right is on their side, that the Harvard, anti-affirmative action decision was a horrible mistake, a hideous, right-wing move that is destructive of every good thing in the Republic. I mean, their attitude towards this decision is entirely negative. And, sotto voce, active resistance is really, I think, their stance. Now, do they overtly embrace that? No. They issue these edicts, these official statements where they say, of course we're going to comply with this decision. But they have a million ways to avoid it. I mean, who knows what goes on in their admissions office?
And I suppose they're the great status conferring institutions in the Republic. And so you can only confront them to such a degree. Without the law on your side.
They're not, as I say, they're not really embarrassed about trying to minimize the impact of this kind of decision or even circumvent it.
Yeah, that's it. You can't embarrass them.
I mean, they would never, say, oh, oops, aren't we awful because we're using race. They think they ought to be using race. They absolutely are convinced, and they haven't been persuaded otherwise by, however many justices of the Supreme Court said about it. The other problem is that the way the Students for Fair Admissions opinion was written by the Chief Justice, John Roberts, and there are multiple opinions, and this is a 257-page extravaganza, this decision, with multiple justices writing. And I teach about this case every summer in a summer course, and so I've had to study it in great detail, and it's quite a project. But Chief Justice Roberts inexplicably created this massive loophole in his decision. He said, no, Title VI and the Equal Protection Clause. I mean, he talks in terms of Equal Protection Clause, which doesn't apply to Harvard, but implies in a footnote, states in a footnote, that Title VI, which does apply to Harvard, is going to be interpreted in the same way as the constitutional equal protection provision. I mean, that in itself is questionable in my mind, but all right, that's the way it is. He says that forbids using race in admissions, but there's nothing stopping a school like Harvard from using essays where people talk about their experience with racism.
Right, I see.
And that, he didn't have to say that. I don't think.
It's a wonderful off-ramp.
He could have said, and, even if you submit essays where people talk about race, you can't use that information either. I mean, he easily could have said that. It's hard to enforce, of course, but it just is more consistent, I think, with the whole tenor of the decision. But he didn't.
So then with public universities,
Yes.
do you think that sort of the Chris Rufo, Ron DeSantis approach is a good one, effective?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a whole nother problem. Right. So DeSantis, in trying to govern and curb what is going on in the Florida State University and University of Florida system, right, has pushed through this legislation, which essentially, I mean, it's complicated legislation, but the bottom line is it attempts to limit the teaching of certain subjects and ideologies, critical race theory, in the university. And frankly, it's probably unconstitutional to do that because the First Amendment does not allow the government, state, local, federal, to favor a particular viewpoint or suppress a particular viewpoint. So I don't think that route is actually going to work or withstand challenge. I mean, once again, it needs to be challenged and it needs to go to court and all of that. But I think controlling the content as such of what gets taught in the university system is, not a successful strategy.
Because it runs counter to the idea of the university itself.
Well, first of all, it's a violation of the First Amendment, which says that government cannot make content distinctions, official sort of content distinctions in what's allowed or what's not allowed in institutions like the university. I mean, the case law is a little complicated because certain arms of the government can control what's said, if that's part of your job, but it's never been part of the job of the university to only present one point of view. I mean, this is where academic understandings and traditions and the First Amendment come together.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is underexplored in the law. I mean, the case law is very spotty. There is a wonderful scholar named Keith Whittington who was at Princeton, I think is now going to Yale, who has written very intelligently about this topic. So I would recommend his work if you're interested in it, or if anybody who's listening to this is interested in it. But I think the way to go is to do in some ways what I recommend under Title VI. Now here you don't have a statute that says if you want money, you have to comply with these conditions.
Yeah.
This can be done directly. Basically, we're funding you, we're legislating the money and allocating the money to support the University of Florida, Florida State University, and one of the conditions of getting the money is you can't have a diversity, equity, inclusion office. You have to have many more teachers and administrators. There are certain programs, administrative type programs that you can't have. You can't have any race conscious admissions. That doesn't solve the problem of a lopsided faculty, of a lopsided curriculum.
Right. So that's a pretty maybe not politically easy solution, but it's fairly simple. So there's some hope in being able to do that.
Well, it will help. It will help. But I think to get at the imbalance in the actual, what's taught, the way to do that is probably to fund and set up these centers within the university. And some of this is starting to happen. So Arizona has done this. There's a center, I forget what it's called. It's got some acronymal name of, civic education or something or other, and have the control of these centers within the university rest with the governor and his henchmen and women instead of ceding that control to the existing faculty,
Right.
deans, administrative structure of the university, which is totally, left.
Yeah. So
I
you're
mean, the
ceding-
problem with these
Yeah.
centers is that if you bring them under the aegis of the university and let the existing university power structure control them, they will quickly turn left. I mean, that happened in Texas. Florida has had some success with University of Florida. Ben Sasse, the former senator, is now the president of Florida. And he has, I'm not sure exactly how he's done it, but I know for a fact that he has, under his watch, a number of conservative scholars have been hired, young conservatives. I know of a few people out of the Harvard government department, Harvey Mansfield's students and acolytes who are now going there. So whatever he's doing, whatever changes he's made to control the hiring process, and I think, the hiring process is where you need to intervene, traditionally controlled by, the powers that be in the department, but no reason why the state can't wrest that control away. They're making some inroads that way.
Okay.
But, here's the problem. I mean, Florida has DeSantis, and he really cares about this. He understands what time it is, as they say. He understands the impact of, these universities on the future of our nation, on the thinking of young people, on our politics, and that this is a very serious matter that needs addressing. But there are very few people like Ron DeSantis out there, even Republicans.
And few people like Ben Sasse as well.
Or like Ben Sasse. The Republicans
and determination. So then the question is, how scalable is this? Can you rely on one or two figures in politics or in academia to sort of change the whole system? I suppose maybe not. But they provide good models.
They provide good models. I think, DeSantis is a good model. And let me just say, and this is a little bit orthogonal here, but the courts have been very deferential in control of what gets taught in K through 12. I mean, there's no case law on that for a reason, which is essentially everybody accepts that you can totally script and dictate.
Yeah.
Right, the government that creates and funds these schools, which the government does, public schools, completely control what public school teachers say and what they teach, and they have no First Amendment rights or no tradition of academic freedom to interfere with that. Yeah. So there's a lot more potential there, which is good because that's where it all starts. Yeah. And DeSantis has had some initiatives on that front too. Now those are being challenged.
His initiatives are being challenged.
Under the First Amendment, but I am not sure at all that they will succeed. So this is kind of a battleground that is ongoing right now. Yeah. But the real problem is that Republican politicians just don't take this issue seriously enough. I mean, they're not that interested.
Yeah.
And they, they're in control of half of the state legislatures. And their attitude is, well, we have to have a university system. We have to have a good university system. And of course, we're going to shovel money their way. And it's not our business to interfere with what's taught.
Well, that's just it, right? That business. Do you think that they've resigned, or conservatives or conservative politicians are resigned to the idea that academia is an inherently sort of leftist occupation, and therefore they deal with that over there, and we deal with the economy and money and industry and all of these sorts of things?
I am not sure that they think about it as academia is inherently leftist. I think it's more like academia isn't that important.
Right.
The indoctrination, the sort of partial picture of our nation and, its history, its purpose that young people get in these institutions is not that great a concern. I just don't think they think about it.
Yeah.
And I don't think they appreciate how corrupting it is politically.
Yeah.
I think they're starting to.
Right, because I suppose the problems manifest somewhat downstream of graduating from these universities, and they don't see it immediately.
They don't. I mean, they're more concerned with economic issues, that sort of thing. They don't understand the Charles Murray coming apart landscape, which is that there's this enormous divide now that's opened up between the working classes and the less educated classes and the educated classes. Of course, the educated classes have grown in size and influence, and they are, very left. As the educated class has grown, the Republicans have lost power. And I think they really need to understand that.
Yeah. So I suppose leaving academia aside, but only slightly because these are related, insofar as the academy sort of forms the character of the people who come out of it. You've written about virtue. You've written about bourgeois virtue, and we were speaking about it earlier. And I wanted to know what you mean by bourgeois virtue. And then later, I'd like to ask about the cultivation of our sort of aristocracy or the cultivation of our elites, and what that should look like as well. But bourgeois virtue, what is that?
Well, I mean, just sort of the conventional behaviors that make for success in a very commercial society, democratic society, such as the one that we have. And, I'm very much talking about our society, not, the Plains Indians or, Genghis Khan or anything like that, but our modern, weird, industrialized, rich, free market society, which has been, of course, extremely successful and very affluent and very good at spreading prosperity. So all of those are good things. But the habits of behavior that yield that kind of result, there's a whole laundry list of those habits, and they include, honesty, reliability, industriousness, thriftiness, restraint, sexual restraint, continence, loyalty, rectitude, obedience to law, trustworthiness. I mean, we could talk about punctuality, which sounds trivial, but it's actually not, because that means that you can do business and don't waste people's time. That sort of thing, and many third world societies don't practice those virtues.
Right.
And so I think they are essential for most people most of the time to the success of our society. And if those values and virtues are rejected or people stop practicing them, that is going to definitely hurt the well-being of everyone. That's the idea.
So the idea they sort of form guardrails for
well,
society
they're
in general.
norms. I mean, these are norms that are part of the picture of the bourgeois virtues, is that they are regarded as virtues. They are, openly announced as desirable and recommended and commended, and their absence elicits disapproval.
Yeah. So how do you inculcate them? You just create a culture where the absence of those virtues elicits disapproval. Why have they maybe escaped from us?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's complicated, but I think the ethos of the 60s, it's come out of a certain ideology, which, you could call it communism, socialism, which is very critical of this kind of commercial society, sees it as exploitative, sees it as oppressive and stifling, exploitative of, labor by capital, that whole shtick, and also stifling to the human spirit, human creativity, and freedom.
Right.
As kind of a philosophy of unfreedom.
Right, because these are all rules by which people can prosper, and there's an idea that maybe, that's a sort of, consumerist is the word.
Yeah, well, it definitely is consumerist.
Yeah.
And consumerism is that kind of materialism is disapproved of. Profit and money making and finance. There's definitely an element of anti-Semitism here, a thread going through the disdain for commercial activity and society. It's kind of an unholy brew of different ideas that come together to produce the liberationist ethos of the 60s. And, a good heavy element of non-judgmentalism, like let it all hang out, anti-establishment, because you have to have a sort of authoritative set of people or, bodies to enforce these rules. Traditionalism, they come down to us from the past. It means respecting older people for their experience and their authority, so it's anti-authoritarian. You can see all the threads here that are undermining the notion that these virtues are virtues and should be commended, should be rewarded, should be enforced. It's just, there's been a kind of disparagement of the virtues, and as a result, fewer and fewer people exemplify them. Although we still retain a substantial class of people who do exemplify them, who are the kind of backbone of society.
Right.
And it's become, oddly enough, our elites, who are in some ways espouse the most progressive left-leaning ideas, who are the most conservative in the way that they actually conduct their lives. This is a paradox that's
talking
been
the
noticed.
60s and living the 50s.
Exactly. Talking the 60s and living the 50s, which is, I always am amused by, although it's actually not funny. And Charles Murray has written about this, Brad Wilcox, I've written about it. Rob Henderson is sort of a new voice on the scene, talks about it a great deal. Yeah,
everyone should read Rob Henderson. He's great.
Luxury beliefs, he calls them, and that's a very clever, I think, trope. And it's everywhere. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's been very destructive. And it's been very destructive of the most vulnerable people in society.
Yeah.
The people who are least well equipped to deal with hardship, to make their own way, to guide their own lives, to choose the right path. In a way, the bourgeois norms, like all norms, right, are there to save people from themselves.
Yeah, to provide a template for success or for stability.
Exactly. And the people we've discovered that the people who most need that template are the less educated, perhaps the less intelligent, the less well endowed with the kind of personality traits and attributes that enable you to govern yourself.
So you can see how it's sort of inhumane for the elites to sort of pour scorn on these ideas.
Right. So the elites purport to care about the less well off, but by their, living the 50s and talking the 60s, they show, but they don't really care. I think.
Yeah, which is why the sort of the luxury beliefs term is sort of so effective, because it really gets at something that probably irks them quite a lot.
Right, it's kind of the modern version of let them eat cake.
Yeah, it is.
But
well, then, do you think that the elites, should have different virtues? Do you think that the sort of modern aristocracy of America should live a sort of different way? or I mean, how do we form our elites, and how do we make sure that we have an elite class of people who understand these problems, understand that there should be solid social norms, that these guardrails should exist? What does it come down to? Is it patriotism? Is it?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's a lot to admire in the way that the blue state elites live, right? Because they get married, they stay together, they raise their children, they work hard, they obey the law. I mean, you can just make a list. So I wouldn't change that. However, I will say this, that I think that the situation is very unstable because of the peddling of these kind of bohemian values, and of course the exigencies of our sort of commercially demanding, economically demanding society, and the kinds of jobs that these people get, and the demands that those jobs entail, and the kind of social life they live, and certainly the sexual liberation fueled by the internet has not helped things. Right. So there is a movement of these elites towards sort of prolonged adolescence, prolonged sexual adventurism that always is threatening to erode these, conventional mores. It's happening in front of our very eyes. I mean, you can see the out-of-wedlock birth rate among, let's say, white college-educated women rising. Now, it's rising from a very low level, right, of under 10%, but each year it's ticking up, and that is very ominous. And men delaying marriage longer and longer, and even some of them, I think, just rejecting marriage. Sort of emulating their lower class brothers. That's ominous too.
And sort of living in a perpetual state of adolescence, which is not good for the polity. Yes,
not coming into full adulthood. Failure to launch, a lot more of that. And I consider those very ominous trends. And you can see it creeping up. You can see it happening. And they're saying that, something like a quarter of women are going to remain unmarried. And more than that are going to end up being childless. And I just think that's a very unstable situation. As I was saying the other day, one of my relatives says, few are the women who can get to the end of their life childless without regret. And I think that is still true. And a lot of women have talked themselves into something else, which is, I don't want children. I want to be free.
Have they talked themselves into it, or have people talked them into it?
They're talking each other into it. I think
really.
They're talking each other into it. I mean, it's this offshoot of feminism that I think is very dysfunctional.
I have a friend who works for a girls' school, and her and some of the other teachers in the school realized they actually don't talk to the girls about marriage, about family formation, any of these sorts of things. And they've suddenly woken up. I mean, they're sort of a younger generation as well, and they've woken up to the idea that maybe they really ought to. They kind of wish someone had spoken to them about it. And so they've started this initiative where they actually just bring it up in conversation. And it's a new thing. They weren't doing that before.
I mean, I've been doing it from the first. When students come to me for advice, I say, well, you can't just think about your professional career. You have to think about your personal life and how you're going to integrate them. And you have to see your life as a whole. And, what's my life going to be like when I'm 50, when I'm 60, when I'm 70? And you can't be so short-sighted about, well, what job do I take and what city do I move to? These are really important to your happiness and the quality of your life, and that's considered a very renegade thing to do. You should get married. You should have children. You should. I mean, this is the advice I've given to my children. And people say, well, that's they're gonna turn off because you're telling them what to do. And I said, well, it's my job. I'm not telling them what to do because I can't tell them what to do. You can't tell your students what to do either. You can only advise them, and sort of hone their attention in on the things that they might overlook and that are important. So I think frankly, I think a lot of the messages they're getting about motherhood and marriage are very, very negative. So anyway, so I think it's a volatile situation for the upper middle classes and the educated classes. But certainly a positive development would be the willingness of that group to endorse and recommend, a more conventional way of life to the lower orders, and point out that this, is the way towards a better existence, a more stable existence, a more satisfying one, and a more economically stable one. And Melissa Kearney has written a book about the two-parent privilege, as she calls it. I hate that word privilege because it's stupid. It implies that something's been conferred upon you rather than you've created it through your own efforts.
Yeah.
But, she has not made herself popular by writing this book,
Really?
Because she marshals and gathers all of the data and information that demonstrates that the best way to raise children and the best outcomes are achieved when a child is raised by the two parents that created him or her, right? That golden triangle of the co-biological family. And of course, part of the unwillingness, the reluctance to set that as the gold standard, recognizing that not everybody's going to achieve the gold standard, but it's an aspiration, right? Is that it's, in tension with gay families.
Right, I see.
Because gay families, by definition, cannot achieve that, co-biological state.
Yeah.
That's just the limits of biology.
But that wasn't always the case, right? So, maybe sort of 10 or 20 years ago, homosexual couples were maybe happy or sort of understood that there's sort of a central case for a family or an aspirational case,
right?
And that maybe they existed on the margin of it.
Yes, I mean, they kind of accept it. I mean, there are people who say, well, that's just oppressive and unacceptable, but I don't agree with that, because that's not the same as persecuting gay people or, discriminating against them. Absolutely not. It's just a kind of recognition that, heterosexual families are the main event.
Yeah.
You're not the main event. And that's just something that you have to live with.
Yeah, so you can have a central case, but be very tolerant and empathetic and sympathetic for all of those that sort of
let people live their lives.
Yeah.
I mean, let gay people be gay, and live their lives, but recognize that there ought to be a degree of veneration and cultural prestige attached to heterosexuality. And what's interesting is, when you talk to people who want, equivalence and equality in everything, you say, well, how do you account for the fact that if parents, even the most liberal parents, are given a preference, they'd rather that their children be heterosexual? This is like a secret vice. I think that people have, and they're ashamed to admit it. And I just think it's kind of a practical preference, my grandchildren will be raised by the parents that made them. I just think that's a better thing.
You can understand
if I had a choice, I'd choose that.
Right,
it's not that I don't love my gay child or...
Yeah, which is completely different to sort of persecution, sort of going out and sort of persecuting a group of people, which is...
I think it's not
totally
a good different
thing. Yeah, exactly.
Frankly.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of like, I mean, this sounds trivial, but it's like saying, if I had my druthers, my child would be, a great scientist, but instead they've chosen to be, a mosaic artist or something. I mean, you have your preferences and your sort of hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly. But if they end up
desirability,
in that,
and that's just expresses your value system,
Yeah.
Or I prefer that my child marry a Jew. I mean, that's considered offensive. I can't comprehend that. I had a colleague who is Jewish who married a non-Jew and was complaining to me bitterly that his parents were not thrilled that he was married this non-Jew. Not that they ever mistreated his wife, but they just weren't like jumping up and down with enthusiasm. And I said, well, you can understand that. I mean, they feel that way because they value the tradition of Judaism, and they recognize that if you married a Jew, likelihood that you would carry that on was greater.
Yeah.
I just took that for granted in my parents.
It's an understandable preference.
For you to condemn them and for your wife to be like grievously offended because, if they had their druthers, they'd rather that you marry a Jew, I think is cracked.
And this is where a lot of sympathy, generosity, and tolerance comes in. And it has to go both ways in all of these situations, I suppose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you have to understand. Actually, I have been in that situation. My husband is not Jewish. Technically, he's half Jewish. His mother is not Jewish. And you may know that Judaism goes down through the mother. If you are a serious Jew, you do not consider someone whose father is Jewish to be Jewish. And my parents were not happy. And it took many, many years for them to just finally, as James Stephen says, give up out of exhaustion. He has this wonderful passage where he says, people argue endlessly about these issues, like, should Jews be in parliament? And finally, one side just gives up. It's not that they convince the other side.
They just said it's not worth it anymore.
I know, right.
Yeah. The other thing on these, on some of these things as well is you mentioned briefly yesterday when we were having a conversation about the valorization of labor, and I was just quite interested in that because it does seem like sort of hard work and diligent work is something which we talk less about. We talk more about sort of the sort of extreme strivers and the people who are going to make $1 million.
Right.
But we talk less about the person who turns up
right.
to work.
The paradigm of upper middle class success, of upward mobility. Upward mobility is like a fetish. And I always say to people, only 20% of people can be in the top 20%. And if you have upward mobility where people rise, then other people have to fall. I mean, this is not sort of a viable paradigm for society to say we have to have this constant upward mobility, and if we don't have that, we don't have a successful society.
Yeah.
I think one of the sort of threads in lefty thinking, and this comes out of the notion that all labor is exploited by capital, is there's this idea of these dead-end jobs that are intrinsically demeaning and unworthy, and I just think we need to get rid of that idea entirely. Of course, this also gives rise to the jobs Americans won't do, which fuels this kind of coolly import culture of we have to bring in these third worlders to do the jobs that Americans won't do.
Maybe if you treated those jobs with more dignity, maybe if people were paid slightly better, that might change the dynamic.
Yes, and we ought to insist upon it. I mean, as a normative matter, not give people excuses for not doing jobs, but say you have to work at whatever it is that you can work at. And not everybody can do, elite complex jobs, and that's just the nature of humanity and the distribution of abilities. And the dignity comes in working, striving to be self-reliant. And, it may be that the economy, it's really hard to manipulate the economy to make every wage a living wage, and nobody's really totally figured that out. But we could perhaps, help support these people, and we have programs that are effectively wage subsidies, right? And they have their perversities, but we have them anyway. And we really do expect you to work. We expect men to work, for sure, right?
Yeah.
And it is the hallmark of male adulthood that you work. And that used to be the case. I mean, it was a source of shame and dismay if a man was out of the workforce, a prime age man was out of the workforce and idle. And now, it's not. And part of it is resulted in a very high unemployment rate among blacks and minorities, and that's completely undesirable. And I think produces a lot of social pathology. There's just a million excuses made for not working, and there should be admiration and dignity for any kind of work. Now, what's interesting is that during the COVID era, I sort of saw a little bit of counter push against that, because there was some appreciation for the people who, were not part of the laptop class, couldn't stay home and
who go out and
work at home, who have to go out there and deliver the services and deliver the food and take care of the sick people, and had no choice but to go to work. And not all of them, but many of them were lesser skilled people. And I think there was some admiration and some true, genuine appreciation for those people. But, after COVID passed, we kind of reverted to our old
it's a shame.
habits.
It's sort of it was a sort of an encouraging thing, which it would have been great if we could have maintained. And I suppose a lot of this conversation has been about some sort of positive things that people can do, positive ways that you could reasonably change some of these institutions which are broken at the moment, the academy in particular.
And, we're kind of stuck because I think the upper middle class people have this idea, well, if you wouldn't want your own children to do it, I mean, everybody has these, who's, well-educated and well-situated in life, has these vaunted aspirations for their own children, and has certain class expectations about what their children will end up doing. So if I don't wish it for my own children, how can I wish it for other people's children? And I say, well, I'm sorry, but that just is illogical.
It's a lack of imagination as well, isn't it? It's a lack of imagination. It's a lack of empathy for other people's situations and abilities.
And the jobs that need to be done. I mean, not everybody can be a lawyer. Not everybody can work for Goldman Sachs. If we can't have a society that consists exclusively of those people, we have to have people doing the basic ordinary jobs, which of course, well-off upper middle class people take for granted that someone will do it, that we will depend on, these people. So there's just a lot of sort of childish fairy tale thinking out there that's very unrealistic.
Maybe a lack of appreciation that the social fabric is a fabric and it requires bringing together lots of different threads in order to sort of make it a thing. On the Restoration podcast, I was going to say, on the Restoration podcast and on the bulletin, we are sort of concerned about positive things that you can do, sort of slightly hopeful ways in which we might be able to mend some of those institutions. And we ask some of our guests, if you had a magic wand, what is one thing you could change overnight? And I wonder if it's sort of the inculcation of these virtues, or if you had something else.
Heavens, one thing I could change overnight. There's so many things that I would change overnight. I guess I would love to see, and I can't explain why it's gotten so bad. I would love to see just a dramatic elevation in the quality of our political class, which I think is just so utterly awful and debased at this point that, it's shameful and aversive. Is that a criticism of Trump? Sure. Is it criticism of the Democratic Party? Absolutely. It just doesn't seem like that long ago that we had leadership that was much more grown up, admirable, people we could look up to. We recently had D-Day anniversary, and it was wonderful to hear, or to recap what Eisenhower said to the troops and what a great leader he was. And I get a little choked up when I think about it. We just don't have leaders that are capable of that kind of rhetoric and humility and pride that we used to have in giving the speech that he gave, and it's very sad.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's incredible. I mean, there's so much gravity in just that, and there is a real crisis of leadership today. But thank you for sharing that in particular. And honestly, I could listen to you talk all day. I've already listened to you talk for the last 2 days at various dinners and some panels that you've been giving. And I'm very, very grateful that you could join us on this podcast. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we need to get the dinner now.
Yes. Drink.
And a drink, yeah. It is a drink.
She's still playing.
She is, I know. It's remarkable.
Drinking.
Very nice.